Now, on to our first guest. It feels like election season in the United States gets longer and longer each cycle. But even though it may seem like we have been talking about the U.S. elections forever, we are still, 6 months away from Election Day. I think it's November 5th here in the United States. And what happens in elections here often has ramifications around the world. And for the edification of our guest speaker, we have people from a number of different countries who are attending this leadership forum. We're pleased to present a 2024 election analysis featuring Josh Kraushaar. Josh is editor-in-chief of the Jewish Insider, essential daily reading. Mine arrives at about 7:05 in the morning, and it's the first, honestly, it is the first website that I go to every day, both for its original reporting and its analysis of issues of importance to our community. And it also publishes every day at the very end, if you have to go to the very end, it also publishes birthdays that day of folks in the Jewish community, some of whom you may know, some of whom you don't. And I think, Josh, I think that people actually go to the birthdays first, and then they work their way back up. In addition, Josh is also a political analyst for Fox News. He'll analyze the 2024 U.S. elections and the role of Jewish policy concerns, and we will offer you all the opportunity to ask questions later on in this program. His Jewish Insider bio notes that he has a track record of identifying election trends before they become conventional wisdom, and that's why we've invited him here today. Now, I want to say one other thing. At this very moment, I think Josh's daughter is playing soccer somewhere. Is that? Sorry?
Ice skating.
Ice skating. Oh, okay, ice skating, even better. And all parents like to visit. Is it a competition?
It is.
Yeah. So to show you how devoted he is to his craft, he took the choice of coming here to be with us. And I hope somebody is videoing your daughter in this competition so you can see it later. Josh, welcome. We're going to begin with an overview from you, so the microphone is yours.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you for those warm introductions. I didn't realize the ice skating element was going to be part of the proceedings, but the beauty of videotape and FaceTime means that we could do both things. And frankly, these are very important times, as you all know. I have sort of an interesting vantage point. It's been about a year and a half since I took over the editor-in-chief spot at Jewish Insider. Little did I know that there would be, sadly, as much news and as much important developments to cover in everything from the war in Gaza to campus anti-Semitism to the political significance of what's happening, not just between the parties, which I'll be talking about momentarily, but within the parties. That the battle of our times, and that's something that I really wanted to dive into when I took the responsibility as editor-in-chief of Jewish Insider. But you hear so much about the horse race and the battle for the presidency. The real battle that we cover extensively that you don't see as much within the mainstream press is that there's a battle for the soul of both the Democratic and Republican parties. It's one that I think the Jewish community has a lot at stake because these very issues and the conclusion and what ends up happening in Washington is going to have a whole lot of impact in what happens on the policy level. So one thing we've been focusing on, in addition to everything else, is just these battles from within, certainly the Democratic Party, the battle between the squad and the mainstream of the Democratic Party, and the battle between the isolationists and the more mainstream elements of the Republican Party. As Dan said, I'm at Jewish Insider. We've been now out for 10 years as a publication. I still call it a startup, but it's been growing by leaps and bounds. I hear more and more people say, I read the New York Times, I read the Wall Street Journal, but I need to have Jewish Insider to actually get a mainstream analysis and reporting on what's happening on all these major issues. And it's become, thankfully, an important part of sort of a lot of folks' daily readership. I always like to do one quick free plug. You go to jewishinsider.com, you put your email in the website, and you get both a copy every morning of all the latest news and reporting and analysis from across the country and abroad. And you also get all of our breaking news updates, which have been coming fast and furious lately. But for most of my 20 years as a journalist, I've been both reporting on and analyzing politics. That's sort of my claim to fame. I've been talking, analyzing, writing a column for both The Atlantic and Axios more recently about all the big picture political trends and putting my little crystal ball on what's going to be happening in every election dating back to 2004. So I wanted to start off by talking about, about 15 minutes to kind of give you my very, very quick big picture breakdown on what's going on in the 2024 elections. But I also wanted to turn over the floor to you after that to get your questions, because there's a whole lot of different areas we can go, and I wanted to have a conversation as much as just a dialogue on my half of things. So the big picture, I'm not going to bury the lead, but if you're looking at the 2024 election and you just showed me the data, you showed me the polls, take Biden's name off of it, take Trump's name off, take parties, just look at who the incumbent is, what they're getting, who the challenger is, right track, wrong track, all the data you see in the polls absent the names. And you said, these are the numbers, what is going to be the outcome of the presidential election? And I think not just me, but probably any election analyst worth their salt would look at the data and say the challenger, the Republican challenger, is probably a pretty heavy favorite to win this election. Let me give you a few data points and then a few caveats, and then I'll talk a little bit about the down ballot side of things too. So look, data point number one. Joe Biden's job approval rating, if you look at the average of polls, is hovering around 40% right now in the spring of 2024. That's lower than Jimmy Carter's was at this point in time in 1980. It's lower than George H.W. Bush's job approval rating was in 1992. Biden has been pretty much underwater with his job approval numbers since the Afghanistan withdrawal, really going back almost to the first year of his presidency. But it's really been the last 2 years where his numbers and the deep disapproval, almost like I don't want to say hatred because we're so polarized, and I feel that term gets tossed around too much, but there is a deep dissatisfaction with the state of the country, and increasingly voters, less partisan voters, are taking out their frustrations on the president. Usually what I would say is the Mendoza line for incumbent presidents, about 45%. If you're at 45%, Obama was maybe a little above 45% around this time in 2012. That's a good sign that you can actually have a good chance to win re-election. 40%, with almost 60% disapproving, big red flags. Like that's just fundamentally the rule of politics. Data point number two: right track, wrong track. There's a lot of good news, I think, on the macroeconomic front. A lot of the predictions of doom and gloom with a recession probably not coming to fruition. Inflation, after suffering through the raising of interest rates and a lot of turbulence on the economic front, it seems to have stabilized, even though it might not be where the White House would like it to be in terms of the spring of 2024. But at the same time, voters aren't feeling that kind of stability. They're sensing that the world is spinning out of control. They're not feeling economically better off than they were 4 years ago. That's for those of you who remember Ronald Reagan's 1984 presidential campaign theme, and the campaign advertisement, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? That's not the message that President Biden can afford to do, even though that's what every incumbent would like to do when they run for re-election. And then you go on all the other issues that are ranked as high priority issues by Americans: crime, immigration, and frankly, anti-Semitism. I mean, that is, I think, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A, but I think that's going to be an important political issue, even more so than the actual war itself in Gaza, because it fuels this sense of disorder that your average American, not just people feeling the brunt of it directly or feeling the after effects of all this craziness on college campuses, but when you see college graduations this week being disrupted by radicals, it reminds you that this is a country that is spinning out of control. That there's no stability. There's no. I mean, the Republicans like to use the word law. There's no law and order. There's no sense that the country's heading on the right track. I think it's also more important for President Biden, who gave a very powerful opening speech to his initial campaign for president back in 2019. Return to normalcy, that he was running for president, he's long said, because of what happened in Charlottesville, the anti-Semitic neo-Nazis in Charlottesville back in 2017. His whole message, his whole candidacy was premised upon standing up to hate, standing up to bigotry, and promising some sense of normalcy from the Trump years. And now that he's president and he's in charge, and that gives you a lot of power and a lot of ability to set the agenda, set the rhetorical tone by using your bully pulpit. And he's not been seen, to put it mildly, as someone who has things under control. And I think it was very telling, frankly, that even after the police went into Columbia, even after the protests that turned violent at UCLA were put under control, it took a day or two, I think, after UCLA for the president to actually come out and give a speech, essentially condemning anti-Semitism publicly and saying that this is unacceptable. These types of violent protests, unacceptable in America. That could have been done the Sunday before Passover. And by the way, they did. I will give them credit. The deputy press secretary, and we talk to the White House pretty regularly. I mean, I think intuitively they are on the right track. They're just afraid to say this publicly, and that makes you wonder what's going. Well, it reminds me very much in 2016. Why was Donald Trump afraid to speak out against the neo-Nazis so unequivocally? And the talk of the time was that, well, like obviously that's not, the policy isn't to support, but they're afraid of this faction of their base that's anti-Semitic, that they don't want to lose those votes. And sadly, I hear this a lot from people that I'm not talking on the record, but they're elements of the Democratic Party now that they are afraid of losing in a tough election the votes of essentially the squad, what I would describe as young progressives, Arab Americans in Michigan. That small faction, which if you look at the data, is a pretty small faction even of the Democratic Party. And I think it's getting smaller now that this has become, you see the campus protests. It's not just people protesting for humanitarian concerns in Gaza. It's a lot more radical. It's a lot more sinister. And I think that's coming out in the mainstream press over the last couple of weeks as these protests have gone on. But I think it took the White House to look at a poll. Instead of having kind of the gut instincts that this is not good politics. This is you want to show leadership. You want to get out in front of this. I think they probably saw some polling showing. There was a Morning Consult poll. I'm still waiting for like a really good poll to kind of assess sort of the politics of the campus protests, but there was a poll that came out from the Morning Consult over the weekend asking, do you support the police essentially going in to clear the campuses out? 78% supported, 10% opposed. Even young voters overwhelmingly supported. So I'm sure they probably had some similar numbers that were like, this is really bad. Like, even if we're trying to pander to keep the coalition together, it's gonna get out of control if we don't say something publicly. And I think, look, that's been, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A as well, but if I had to kind of assess what's going on in the country writ large, there's a lack of lead. People are afraid to lead. University presidents are afraid to lead. Corporate institutions are afraid to speak out in favor of the 80% majority. They're scared of the 10%. They're scared of the kind of outspoken but pretty out there 10%. And it's sort of, and I talk to the White House pretty regularly, but a lot of people acknowledge that. They've said this publicly too, that Gaza is not a big issue for even Democratic voters. It ranks very low. It's not the economy. It's not unemployment. But I think they worry also, and this goes into the data point number 3. They worry that at 81 years old, Biden just is unable to drive home a message, is unable to use the bully pulpit in a way that a president can usually do to set the message. It's a skill that, it's an advantage, a huge advantage. Obama was probably one of the best at it in my lifetime. But you're standing in front of a podium. You can basically set the news agenda, as you so please. And yet, because of Biden's age, because of his inability to really kind of show strength and use that bully pulpit to his advantage, I don't think they feel like, if you're going to try to give a powerful message, you want to have a principle that can do so. And I think they're also worried about Biden's frailty. He's 81 years old, and he isn't able to drive the message that you would expect a typical president to do. And I think that's part of also the reticence to have Biden essentially be out front and center versus putting out statements, which have been largely very good from this administration. But it's a statement from a deputy press secretary. It's not the voice of the president on television. I also will say data point number 4, which might be the most surprising to me if you asked me a year ago. But I mean, the big wild card I always have said in this election is Donald Trump. I mean, for Donald Trump, I mean, he is deeply disliked by the American public. People remember the chaos of his first term. And I assumed that we'd be talking about the January 6th trial, like taking place right now. I assumed that, as much as people may have their qualms with President Biden, that Trump would be seen as more destabilizing, as more chaotic, as more problematic, that the trials would overwhelm any discussion of policy that could rebound to the Republican Party's advantage and to Trump's advantage. But what we're seeing now, and looking at the data, just and nothing else, you saw this in the primary. None of the challengers running on that message got any traction. I mean, Nikki Haley, I think, was arguably the most effective, but she didn't come close, and she was winning over the 20% of the Republicans that probably have somewhat left the party, that are probably the least reliable Republican voters, the traditional Republican Party, if you will, and Trump utterly dominated in state after state. And even and I still thought, like, in a general election, fine, the primary voters of the that's why you have primaries, and the general elections are often different. But look at ratings of all the TV networks that are covering the trials; they're not up. People aren't. The Stormy Daniels case, I think, is seen widely as more frivolous than the other more serious cases. So it actually adds to this Trump argument that you have people out to get him, that the deep state's out to. It's utterly absurd. But to have this case, which is frankly a little more frivolous than the other more serious cases, ended up redounding to his political benefit. And you look at the polls, and Trump's numbers have actually, it depends on what poll you look at, but they basically stayed still. The court's day-to-day goings-on have not moved the numbers one bit. I guess it's possible that if they get a conviction in Manhattan, maybe there'll be a slight shift in the data, but we haven't seen that so far. That's the dog that didn't bark. And I don't think in our partisan times you're going to see any notable movement. Maybe the more Trump's on TV, maybe it hurts him a little bit, but I don't think the fundamentals of this election are going to change a whole lot. And I think if you look at almost every poll now, Trump is up by about 2 to 3 points on average, but it's hard to find a poll. There are a few polls that show Biden up by a point or two. I would also caution that when you look at the national polling numbers, Biden probably needs to win the popular vote by about at least 2 points because there's so many votes in California and New York, they kind of get wasted for Democrats. So it's coming down to Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Those would be the 3 states. I would maybe Nevada too, if I had to name a 4th. But those states, if you look at the battleground numbers, it's just tough. Biden's down in most of those polls as well. So it's just, it's tough times to be an incumbent when the public doesn't think the country's headed on the right track, and you don't have a principal who's able to kind of show off a charisma or sort of drive a message that can really change things. The biggest difference, by the way, this basic poli-sci 101 between 2020 and 24, and it has less to do with ideology, it has a lot to do with just the fundamentals of who the incumbent is and who the challenger is. Your voters who don't pay attention to the news like we all do, they just look at who's in charge and if things are good or bad, and then they blame the incumbent. He's the boss, right? Trump weathered a lot of criticism because the COVID crisis was taking place in 2020. His chaotic management of everything was really weighing on people's minds, and he bore that burden. Even though it's the same matchup, it's the same candidates, Biden now bears the responsibility of what's going on the campuses. He bears the responsibility of what's taking place with the economy. He's bearing the challenges of what's happening, crime, elevated from where it was 4 years ago. So that's just fundamental politics. The challenger ultimately has an advantage if things are bad because they can just blame, even if it's not Biden's fault, you can just blame the person in power. Now, I will offer a couple caveats. I mean, I guess as a professional pundit, you want to kind of hedge your bets. But I would say, I do want to put a number on what I think the odds are that Biden, Trump loses. I think Trump has about a 65% chance of winning an election. I'd say Biden about 35 to 40%. I do think that there are 2 things that could play into Biden's favor. I want to point them out. When you look at the polls, if you're a real nerd like I am, and you just look at the methodology and the deep dive of all the crosstabs, Biden has an edge when it comes to likely voters. The people who are showing up in these local elections. You may be in if you're in Long Island, you saw this special election in George Santos's former House seat. Tom Suozzi, who's a moderate Democrat, pro-Israel Democrat, easily won. If you look at these local elections, Democrats have been doing quite well. Now, local elections, special elections, they consist of the most dedicated, devoted, civic-minded voters, right? Presidential elections, in recent years have been, 60% turnout, huge turnout. Almost everyone shows up, or a lot of people show up. These local elections are a subset of that election, of that electorate. Democrats have been doing really, really well in these local elections. Some of that is because the coalitions have changed somewhat since Trump came on the political scene. Republicans used to be the party of the most dedicated voters, the college-educated voters, the people that would volunteer and lick envelopes and hand out direct mail to their neighbors. Under Trump now that's changed, and a lot of those same voters are now voting either independent, or they're independent, or they're voting even Democratic at this point. But the most dedicated voters are actually now more the Democratic base voters. Abortion is the best issue right now for Democrats. Abortion rights, protecting abortion rights. It's one that's put Trump and Republicans on the defensive. And a lot of those voters are showing up in these local elections to showcase their opposition to Roe v. Wade being overturned and all these pretty draconian state laws, Arizona being the most recent one, that has really gotten the Democratic base and a lot of Democratic core voters out to the polls. Unfortunately for Democrats, when you look at the broader electorate, abortion does not rank as high of an issue. It's more economy, more kind of what are you doing for me lately? And if you kind of look at polls like most analysts do at this point in time, you tend to look at the registered voter, the broader universe of voters. And in that score, Trump has an advantage. The higher turnout helps Donald Trump. So I could see a scenario, I don't think it's likely, but I could see a scenario where people are just so disgusted with everything that's going on. And a lot of people who say they like Trump, maybe they stay home. And if that's the case, then that could give Democrats a sort of a secret advantage that you don't necessarily see in the poll. So that's one thing that I'm looking at. The other thing is the presence of third-party candidates, which the conventional wisdom up until a few weeks ago was that a lot of these third-party candidates were going to hurt Joe Biden. And certainly Cornel West, who I don't know how many state ballots he's going to be on, and Jill Stein, the Green Party nominee, those are going to be voters that take away votes from Biden. RFK Jr. is getting about 10% of the vote, which would be the highest third-party share of the vote if that held since, I believe, Ross Perot in 1996. The conventional wisdom that he was actually taking more votes away from Biden. We've now had three straight top-notch national polls. One from ABC News today, one from NBC News a week ago. I think the other one was a Monmouth poll. It actually shows RFK Jr. pulling a lot more votes away from Trump. And it makes a little sense because of the issues that RFK is talking about. Anti-establishment, don't trust the elites, vaccine issues. They actually may end up pulling more and more away from Trump. So that's another wild card. Stein and West combined might get 3-4% of the vote. If RFK gets double digits, that could have a big impact at the margins. And if he does take away more from Trump, or people who are just sick of everything and they end up voting, and more of the Republican-leaning voters vote for Kennedy, that could be a wild card. So those are the two big kind of things I'm watching that could play to Biden's advantage. Really quickly, I know I promised 15 minutes and then opening it up to questions. I want to give you a really, really quick overview of the down ballot race, or the down ballot landscape. The Senate, by virtue of the map itself, forget about the political environment. Democrats are, because they did so well in 2018, which was a great year for Democrats, Trump's first midterm, they're defending almost entirely the turf in 2024. And a lot of these big races are actually in red states that Donald Trump won, like Montana and Ohio and West Virginia. So Democrats they're resigned to having no better than a 50-50 Senate. Joe Manchin's seat is going to go Republican. If that's the only thing that happens, you got a 50-50 Senate. There are eight other Senate races that Democrats are playing defense in, some in red states, some in purple states. If it's a good night for Democrats, they only lose, one of those seats. I mean, I think it's almost inevitable that Republicans take at least a narrow majority because of the map, not because of it, not because of anything else. If it's a bad night for Democrats, if Joe Biden loses the presidential election, I could see races like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada going and having something of a wave, which could get Republicans maybe as many as 54, 55 seats. If it's a good night for Democrats, they'd be happy if they lose the Senate, but they can get it back in 2 years, get 51 seats. But they're playing. I've never seen a map. I've covered down ballot races and congressional politics for 20 years. I've never seen a map that's this unfavorable for one party. And so Democrats are just playing defense, and Manchin's retirement pretty much guaranteed that Republicans have a 50-50 Senate at least to start out. The House is the big. I mean, that's the really interesting chamber. You have this crazy, evenly divided House. Mike Johnson actually passed some pretty consequential legislation with Republicans and Democrats, a big majority. But you have these right-wingers in his caucus that are giving him hell and making his life miserable. I would have said 6 months ago that the right-wing dominance of the party, the dysfunction in the House, McCarthy being defenestrated would have been sort of giving Democrats the edge in the battle for the House. But in the last month, Mike Johnson sort of given the middle finger to Marjorie Taylor Greene, passed some pretty consequential legislation, and now it's the Democrats that are like having to deal with Ilhan Omar and their Rashida Tlaib and AOC and their left-wing flank, especially on the issue of anti-Semitism. So all of a sudden, the tables have turned a little bit over the last couple months politically. You also have almost a quarter of the toss-up races are going to be in New York and California, mostly suburban seats. Frankly, seats with a high level of Jewish constituencies: Los Angeles, New York City, Long Island. Anti-Semitism is going to be a big issue in a lot of those races. These are mostly Republican incumbents. Mike Lawler, you may well know, in Westchester County. You have Michelle Steele and Young Kim in the Los Angeles area. You have a lot of Republicans that otherwise would be vulnerable. But I think the politics, if you vote for Biden, top of the ticket, like many of these voters in those districts will, and given everything that's going on, I think Republicans have had a little bit of a wind at their back in some of these toss-up type of races. So I think the House is something of a coin flip. I would maybe say you have a very narrow Republican majority, and I don't think it's going to change a whole lot. It's either a narrow Democratic majority, a narrow Republican majority. The redistricting process, which Democrats thought they would do a better job of getting more seats in New York, it didn't work out that way. North Carolina is going to give Republicans 3 more seats. Frankly, a lot of pro-Israel Democrats are going to get lost in the mix in North Carolina, especially Kathy Manning, as part of the redistricting process. But I would say 50-50. The coin flip for the House. But I will say the biggest change, and I would have come here 2 months ago and said, look, Republicans are going to be, they're really worried that they're going to lose the House, and they have these crazy people that are like dominating the conversation. Now I'm coming here telling you that it's the Democrats that are worried that they have a lot of crazy people that are front and center at a time when anti-Semitism is one of the big issues right now. So that's my very, very quick and Cliff Notes version of the state of politics. But I know you have a lot of questions, and I'm up for anything politics.
Thank you very much. These demonstrations may very well be Joe Biden's Vietnam. Now, there's sounded to me like a little bit of overstatement here.
Yeah.
But is it possible that even at this late hour, because the convention is coming up soon, in a matter of months.
Yep.
Is it possible that what Bernie Sanders is saying is Joe Biden step aside, scaring him with the Lyndon Johnson reference?
I'm hearing a lot of 1968 comparisons. I wasn't around during that very turbulent time. I've read American history, but I wasn't around to kind of appreciate. Look, the biggest difference between now and 1968 is that the protesters protesting the Vietnam War actually had skin in the game. I mean, this was, I always say the first rule of politics is if it's going to affect you, most people really aren't paying attention to what's going on in the Middle East or what's going. I mean, if you have skin in the game, if you have a direct connection, you're going to care. You're going to vote. Frankly, most Americans are apathetic. They're disconnected from these issues. The biggest challenge is getting people to care about your issues. It's not the radicals. It's not the people on the right side. It's literally getting people engaged. So the difference between 1968 and now is that everyone was engaged. I mean, if you first of all, there wasn't. I don't get the sense that there was like a student versus student. There wasn't an anti-Semitic element, which puts this in a whole other category. But at the same time, there also wasn't. in 1968, what was I going to say? In 1968, the biggest difference is that a lot of people were going to be heading to Vietnam. They were going to be drafted. That's not the case. This is coast play for a lot of these protesters. I do think there are some broader political similarities. I mean, to the Bernie point, you have a president that seems overwhelmed by events. It was not the president, it was Humphrey in 68, but LBJ stepped down. Humphrey looked like he was holding the LBJ position, and he just wasn't able to really confront his own coalition. So there's a similarity there. You do have a deep division within the Democratic Party that in 1968 that exposed itself with George Wallace as a third party candidate. Like I said, I think RFK might be a little different because he may actually end up pulling more from the right, but there is some parallels with Wallace in that same disillusioned working class constituency might go to RFK that found a home with Wallace in 1968. And just the protest, the unrest and the inability taking over building. I mean, there are a lot of parallels. Just look at the broadest picture. Look, Bernie's going to be a problem. I mean, one thing that I think I always say, one of my big cliches when analyzing politics, always look what people do, not what they say. And one thing that someone said last night, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Elissa Slotkin, who is the Senate candidate in Michigan. She's a very important congresswoman, Jewish, in a swing district. Very, very savvy. Very I always talk to her campaign. Always have talked to her as well. Just get a sense of. And she's been pandering, frankly, to a lot of the Arab votes in Dearborn and the left-wing votes in Ann Arbor. She put out a Twitter thread last night unequivocally condemning what was going on across the street here at GW with the anti-Semitic slogans, the threats to kill university leaders, and it was a pretty strong condemnation of the style I have not heard from her. She has been criticized for being very reticent to deal with this issue. She's a Columbia graduate, by the way. She hasn't said anything about Columbia. For the first time last night, she put out a very strong, very unequivocal thread about what's happening on campuses. I'm a cynical political reporter. I'm sure they've seen polling that even in Michigan, this stuff is not playing well. So I don't know if Bernie may be right that the coalition is kind of breaking apart, but I don't think Biden is going to be giving his guidance a whole lot of attention.
Okay, thank you. So we'll go to the floor. Sammy?
Thank you, Josh.
Why don't you stand? It might be easier so everybody can hear you.
Thank you, Josh. Listen, there are a few things that voters feel like is important to them. I would think the first thing would be the economy. In the United States, one of the second thing would be immigration. They're very concerned about the situation of jobs and immigration. The third one would probably be a tie between drugs and abortion, which is a toss-up thing. Now, why do you think that, and I don't agree with that, why do you think that anti-Semitism is going to have a rank in this election? I mean, when this is over, at the colleges. Right now it's just news, okay? It doesn't really having an impact. I don't see an impact. I don't even see an impact in the Jewish communities. We all feel impacted.
Yeah.
But we don't see the impact.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's going on with going forward to the election on anti-Semitism?
So I would agree with the first point you made, and I think this is sort of self-evident from the polls. The economy, immigration, and abortion, top three issues, bar none. But there's also, when you look at politics, there's the mood music. There's the kind of broader context in which elections are run in. 2004 was the war. The war in Iraq. I don't know if that was. I think the economy was still the number one issue in 2004. But everyone was thinking about what was going on in the Middle East. That was the mood music. What makes the anti-Semitism on campuses, I think, so potent, is twofold. First of all, number one, it plays right into the Donald Trump campaign message that he's been spouting since 2016. And I didn't think it was that based in reality in 2016. I do think it's actually much more based in reality of what's happening in 2024, which is that the country's out of control. That people may not, if you look at the number of, non-Jews who don't rank it's a non-issue for them. But when they see what's happening at their kids' school, when they see the fact that cops are being assaulted on or a janitor, who was attacked on Columbia's campus. When you see the anti-cop, anti-American, hate America first rhetoric that emanates from that, that's the big difference from what happened these past 2 weeks than everything else that's happened since October 7th from a political standpoint. I don't think most Americans are paying a whole lot of attention on what's happening in the Middle East as much as it's dominated our news screens. I do think certainly a lot of people from the center to the center right and beyond are paying attention to what's happening on college campuses, are paying attention to, my God, since anyone who's lived through 9/11, I think there's sort of this part of everyone's DNA that they're kind of, when they hear anti-American, pro-terrorist slogans, I think that's much more than anti-Semitism. That's how Bush won the re-election in 2004, by raising a question about his challenger's inability to handle the threat from abroad. And I think what's happened these past 2 weeks is a reminder to the broader American public that this goes beyond what some kid is dealing with on Columbia's campus. It's about a fundamental shift in sort of the zeitgeist, if you will. And I think that's why Biden came out. That's what, if he agreed with the whole notion that it's only I think that's sort of what some of his advisors have been saying. Just the economy, just abortion, just immigration. You don't give a speech like that unless you're seeing that this is really going to do some damage if you don't confront it directly. And I think it's because it transcends just the narrow issue of anti-Semitism.
Okay, Rebecca.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for coming. Alan Lichtman recently gave an analysis of his 13-point predictions favoring Biden, and I was just wondering if you could offer a comparison between his predictions and your predictions favoring 60% for Trump.
So I went to American University. So Alan Lichtman, he's a professor at American. I think he's still a professor at American University. He has this famous predictions on how who's going to win the election. So I went to American University. I took his class. He predicted Gore was going to win the 2000 election when I was there. So I think he claims that it's the right. Look, we'll see. I would say the thing with Lichtman. I just say from a political science point of view, Alan Lichtman's criteria are very subjective, right? So he's not saying like if the economy is growing at this rate, this is who's going to win. He's saying things that are basically designed to be your decision on whether things are going well. Like there's some of the factors are not actually empirical criteria, and that's it's great. I enjoyed his class. Like I have nothing bad to say about Alan Lichtman. I would say though, I would give a slight advantage. Like I said, 60%. I would say to Trump at this point.
Let's see. Yes, in the back. Go ahead.
Hi.
So you'll have to speak up a little bit because I don't think we have the floor. So go ahead.
Okay. Could you explain or develop a little the vice president's selection for Biden-Trump and the impact in 4 years in the next election, please?
Yeah, great. Well, the big story, this has been, I've said this to some of my staff at Jewish Insider, like little did I know that when I took the job over a year ago that politics is, the discussion of who Trump's running mate is going to be is now taking a back seat to the anti-Semitism, to the stories that we cover on a day-to-day basis. It is sort of remarkable how much a lot of the traditional horse race politics has receded as a result of other events in the news. Look, the big story is going to be Trump, who Trump chooses as his running mate. I think it's sort of a signal of how he intends to govern. There's a lot of questions on whether he's, the first term was chaos, unpredictability, instability, but he ultimately deferred to a lot of conventional Republican officials, Jim Mattis, the people who got kicked out, but they basically did the service of the so-called establishment. They kind of kept the administration grounded, and despite all the chaos, like it was. Look at the policy; it was generally a lot of it was generally conventional Republican policy, with a very significant degree of instability at the top. So I think if Trump picks someone like a J.D. Vance, whose name has been mentioned, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, who's one of the most outspoken isolationists in the United States Senate, who shares a lot of the heterodox views that Trump has campaigned on, but didn't really govern totally on in his first term. I think that would be a signal of what the policy direction is of if Trump won a second term. If you pick someone like a Marco Rubio, who's also being mentioned, if you pick someone like a Doug Burgum, North Dakota governor, who was on a lot of I think one of the Sunday shows today, that's a more conventional pick. It might be a signal that he needs to he needs to get the Nikki Haley voters to vote for him, and that's a concern, and you're actually starting to hear. I think one of the more underplayed developments of the last month is when Mike Johnson went to Mar-a-Lago, and essentially Trump called Marjorie Taylor Greene off from her, she was opposing the Ukraine funding bill that Johnson was supporting. And Trump has sort of, if you watch carefully, has changed his rhetoric from being a vociferous anti-Ukraine, sort of almost like pro-Putin type rhetoric from his social media feed, and he's actually given Mike Johnson quiet backing to pass that very contentious legislation. So, I mean, Trump is sort of anyone who tries to says they know what Trump's going to do in a second term, that's the big question mark. That's the big mystery. Who's going to pick for the cabinet? Who's going to pick for his vice president? Biden's running with Harris. There's not going to be a shift on that ticket. I think the question for Biden is, if a year ago he had the opportunity to switch his running mate and kind of make a kind of a bold, risky decision and change the ticket like FDR did, in 1944, or you've seen this. I guess Ford did. I think in the 70s, Rockefeller with Dole. Those are the kind of risky, bold decisions that often can win or lose an election. Biden is a very cautious politician, not just on politics but on foreign policy as well, and he decided to stick with Harris, and he's going to have the benefits and the downsides of that as well.
Let's see. Hold on 1 second. Gary?
Thank you for your comments. We all know that we're 6 months out from the election, and events can occur in these next 6 months which alter thoughts, and it's usually those events or those circumstances that are really hot in that last month or right before the voting polls open when they're advanced voting. What do you see as a potential altering impact, either way, for changing what seems to be a status quo movement right now?
Yeah.
When you've got good and bad components on each side, elements of fringes out there, and the impact, if anything, not just to Israel in the Middle East, but in Europe or other parts of the country with China in terms of their influence or attempted influence to things that they would like to see that is a pro-candidate. How do you see maybe something coming down the road that might have impact?
Yeah, the October surprise, there's always an October surprise for political or actually substantive reasons. Look, I think the two things that come to mind, number one, I actually think the European front is going to be something that would be of consequence if Russia, God forbid, advances and really puts Ukraine on its back. That would be a very destabilizing moment. It actually could benefit. I mean, it could go either way. Actually, I could see it hurting Biden for the reasons I said. You're the guy in charge, and if this happens under your watch, you're probably going to get blamed. But Trump's anti-Ukraine rhetoric could also hurt him. I certainly think that could hurt him if he becomes president and he ends up. If he doesn't give Ukraine the support it needs and bad things happen, Trump could really, if he's president, could really suffer the political consequences in that scenario. But, in the middle of a campaign, if that happened, I think it could have a lot of significant effects. It's hard to say. I think it would probably hurt Biden more, but it's up. I think it's up for grabs. Health is the other wild card. If God forbid, Biden had a severe health issue, couldn't run. Trump as well. They're both, it's hard to believe. You have an 81-year-old and a 77-year-old, by far the two oldest nominees ever to run for president, or ever to be nominees of their parties. That is something that I think is, it's definitely something we've not really dealt with, and it's possible you could have a health issue that could really, really shake things up.
Okay. Paolo Fuller from Milano.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your.
You want to use this, Paolo?
Yes, go ahead. I'm from Italy, and I don't make a question about Europe, but I have this look. I understood that there is a lot of states that we know already who is the winner, and few states is the win state. But is there a risk for the candidate to run to lead in the win state, to lose some, to forget some other state, and to have a surprise in November?
So the question is there a risk if you spend too much time in Wisconsin and ignore, Nevada or something? I mean, look, the states that are not swing states are unlike. I mean, if it is a landslide election, right? If there's a big wave that happens at the end of I mean, that's what happened in 1980, right? Polls showed Reagan and Carter neck and neck, and all of a sudden there was this huge wave towards Reagan, and it was a landslide of epic proportion. You're not going to see an election like that, given how divided we are. But look, could I see a scenario where the bottom falls out for Biden? If something like we just talked about happens, you could New Hampshire, Virginia, Colorado. Could you see? I don't think so. I think we're still pretty much in kind of 50-50 divided territory, and I don't think anyone's going to have any regrets that they didn't spend any time in a certain state. It's really 7 states that are maybe 8 that are battlegrounds that are, you're going to see both candidates spend the most time in: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia. Probably forgetting one. If anyone knows the seventh, that is the big one. But those are like the big ones. Those are the big ones. And look, in 2016, a lot of Democrats didn't think Michigan was going to be in play, and then Trump wins Michigan. He didn't need Michigan. Like, Michigan was sort of icing on the cake. But if that happens, I don't think it's going to be the decisive state. I think the decisive state is going to be one of those 6 or 7 that the presidential candidates are in. First of all, neutral. I mean, it reminds people of the January 6th, what happened on January. People forget quickly, but the fact that he starts his rallies by promising to free what he calls these obscenely the hostages of people who are in jail for committing like horrible crimes on January 6th. Like, reminding people of what happened. You saw this during the committee hearings. It wasn't much movement, but you could see small movement away from Trump the more his actions on January 6th were front and center. But I don't think that's going to be the case. I don't think the schedule of all these cases are going to line up to the point where, maybe the trial will take place in the fall. It's possible that you could have some of that. But it sounds like it's going to be after the election, or certainly a verdict after the election. So that's the only thing I really, outside of health, that I really could see moving the needle. Maybe a conviction in this New York, in this Stormy Daniels, maybe. You do see some polls saying if Trump is convicted that they might rethink their decisions. But if what's happened, if past is prologue, I just think we're kind of stuck in kind of the morass, and we're only going to see small movement either direction.
Abraham Goldstein from Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Hi, well, thank you, George. One simple question, maybe not a simple answer, but considering the importance of the United States worldwide, considering the importance internally, the largest economy in the world and will continue to be for a few years, why both parties we were not able to identify better candidates, considering the one that we have today?
You have just asked the $64,000 question. How do we have this matchup in the first place? How do we have like 2 80-something-year-old candidates that are deeply, deeply disliked? Look, that would take a whole nother speech, but let me give you throw out a few things. Number one, negative polarization, which you may have heard that term, but it basically means you don't support a candidate. You hate the other side. That's your political identity is not in who the nominee is, it's who the other guy is. So, most Democrats, you see this in polls, they don't love Biden, but they're going to vote for him because they hate Trump, right? And vice versa. So that dynamic, along with the familiarity that, tends to benefit if you're an incumbent or you're a familiar face, those two things have kind of helped seal the rematch in place. I also think, social media, it's sort of a paradox. We're in very destabilizing political times, but being a name, being a brand, kind of benefit. I mean, it takes a lot of work if you're Nikki Haley, or you assume that people know who these people are. It takes a lot of effort to get the name identification to the point where you can really raise the money and mount a serious campaign. So I don't think that's the only reason why Trump won so easily and Biden didn't face any credible challenge. But I think that also is a factor. I'd also add internationally, like the one thing, this is less to do with Biden and Trump and more to do with sort of the rise of extremes on both sides. But this is not an American phenomenon at all. You see this in England, you see this in South America. Brazil just lurched from right to left on the far. There's a history of that. I think more in South America, not so much in Europe. But you look at the communist and the very fascist right-wing vote in France. That's much bigger than I think people realize. Germany is dealing with AfD. There's a lot of this is an international phenomenon. It's not just an American phenomenon, and I think people forget Forget that. I think it has a lot to do with how people get their news, how people consume information. We're in the middle of an information revolution. AI is, killing the jobs of reporters, the people who actually try to be dispassionate and get facts to everyone. And we're now in a era where 40% of people aged 18 to 29 are getting their news on TikTok, which is owned by the Chinese Communist Party. That's crazy. I mean, it's kind of insane, right? I mean, that the notion that you would have like a major news, or that's my parent, I have a sort of a legacy of my dad and my grandfather working for the Federal Communications Commission. My grandfather was involved in a lot of the big regulation cases where, ownership of different TV stations or newspapers. The notion that you would have, a major news source, potential news source, being owned by like the Soviets in that would be unthinkable. And we've allowed that to happen because we're too afraid to say, hey, this is unacceptable. And it's now the toothpaste is well out of the tube.
Let's see. Yes, go ahead.
You already indicated that it's going to be a close election. Biden wins. Do you see another January 6th insurrection?
I really don't know. I would say that I worry in a close election that you have like, I worry that there's going to be, in a close election, there's going to be bad news regardless, right? I feel like we're so divided and so unwilling to kind of, accept kind of the reality. But I do worry about that. Yeah, I do. I was actually worried that Trump's, if we had the trial on January 6th on the original timetable, that could actually lead to, even before the election, you could have instability. I guess the one, I don't know if it's encouraging, but there haven't been many like pro-Trump protests in front of the New York. He's been trying to get people to show up in New York, and very few have. So if there's any positive indicator, I try to be a little bit glass half full, is that people are a little more disengaged than they were in 2016 and 2020, writ large, and you're not seeing, like, Trump has been trying to gather sort of the pro-Trump kind of marchers and protesters, and they have not showed up at all. So there is a more disengaged element of the overall electorate, but I do worry about the extremes and what could lead to, and if it's close.
What does close mean?
Within the same three states that they're decided by, very narrow one percentage point margins or less. Like that's what happened even in 2020. That was
Last election was 80-point difference. It was three.
Right,
They both had the same basic. Trump and Biden basically had the same results as far as electoral college votes.
Right.
When they had just over 300, the winner.
Right. I think when it comes down, if we don't know the election result, like after midnight on election night, then it's a close race. Yeah.
Okay, so welcome to election night in America. We just got time, unfortunately. Sorry?
What's going to happen?
I can't see beyond the pillar. We have time for one more question, and it really has to go to our president, Seth Ricklin from Houston.
Josh, first, thanks for being with us. So my question is, going back to something you talked about, and I think it's, you touched on pieces of it, and that I think it's really going to come down to, and I'd like you to speak to, the reliable voters. Yeah. Because I think we're seeing on multiple levels a lot of voters who are just getting the ick from both sides. But the one thing that we've seen in the interim election is that the reliable women voters who have a stake in this race, and they're watching things going on in ugly things that are being talked about in the state of Texas, where I'm from, in other states of the South, where they are clamping down on women's rights and really going after women as a villain here. That I think you're going to see a lot of women driven to the polls, and they're going to be the reliable Democratic voter, the reliable Joe Biden voter. On the other hand, you have the Trump voters, and you've spoken. He's trying to get people out, and then they're kind of like going, "I got the ick from you," and the guys who would be out there in the red hats and dancing, they're not there. And I just don't see I think his reliable number of voters is dwindling rapidly. And the other thing you brought up was AI.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see something in terms of AI on TikTok and other places, ads and fake voices of candidates that we've never seen before. And I'd like you to kind of address that as well.
Those are really good questions, really good themes. I think one thing tying the first two items together is for every action, there's a reaction. For every poll showing women favor Biden by 20 points, men favor Trump by like 20. So I would caution not. It's easy to look at a crosstab. It's easy to look at one little slice, and it's important to look at the whole picture. And I agree with if you have a lower turnout, if the Trump stands that showed up in record numbers in 2016 and 2020 that don't always vote, if they don't show up, then that would have a big impact. Like we're seeing that in actual local elections, congressional special elections, that Democrats have an advantage in that they do have like the first tranche of 100%. I'm voting no matter what, come hell or high water. That is an advantage Democrats have. They have, in fact, I think one reason you don't hear a lot about voter suppression anymore. I think it's not to be sort of cynical about it, but I think it's because Democrats now realize that lower turnout actually helps them, not hurts them, at least among like a lot of the less likely to vote voters. I think the challenge, though, is going to be with young voters. I mean, that goes to your second question. Trump, you're right. Like, I think Trump's big challenge is to make sure that people who are, I really am disillusioned with this whole process. I tend to maybe agree with Trump more, but he's just too crazy. He's in trial. Like, I'm not going to show up. I'm just, voting or maybe even voting Kennedy. But Biden has to deal with the campus kids, and he has to deal with what really is the young progressives, which is also a pretty sizable, not a huge chunk, but it's also that same chunk of the Democratic coalition that was a big vote, high turnout in 2016 and 2020. So again, like I try to I have the same reaction you do. I have that same, what I'm looking at, and then it's like, oh yeah, there's the other side of the coin. With each side has to deal with their disillusioned voters. Each side has to deal with the gender gap is at historic levels. By the way, like abortion is a winning issue, and that it's Democrats' best issue. But the risk for not a risk, but the reminder they need to remind themselves is not to forget about the other issues and make sure they have a holistic argument to the voters.
We gotta, unfortunately, we really gotta thank you very much. And listen, you can follow Josh Kraushaar. You can follow him every day, the Jewish Insider. You get a lot of new readers, Josh, as a result of this.
Thank you.
And on Fox News, he's a fixture on Fox News. Josh, thank you for taking the Sunday morning and coming over here. Everybody is going to leave enlightened. We've got 6 months to the election. We'll be following what you've said very closely. And thanks again for joining us. Good luck to you.
Great.